Hi, my name is Johnna, and it is Monday, so that means that this is week 3 of Makeup and Mental Health Monday. I am super excited to be here. This is like a cool conversation for me because today I'm going to be talking about the toxicity of should. If you're new, then what this is, I've started doing my makeup while I talk about mental health because both of those things are important to me. And if you are into one or the other or either, I suggest you subscribe. The conversation continues in the comments, so make sure that you put your insights there, share your experiences if you're open to that, and just let me know what's up. So with that being said, all products listed are going to be, or all products used are going to be listed in the description below. And if last week I was like, we're going to be talking about how to find yourself, self-discovery, that was a whoopsie doodle. That's next week. We will be covering that. I will be talking about that, and that is also a very important one. But I have my notes, and what we're going to be talking about today is the toxicity of should. So, without further ado, my face is prepped. Let's get right into it. So, the toxicity of should. I think that a lot of times we hear people saying like, oh, you should do this, you should do that. And it's one of those things where we, what I should do is not necessarily what you should do or what someone else should do. I mean, like vice versa. But we see these shoulds and like they come from different places. And so I want to talk about all of that because the premise here and the reason is because these shoulds can be really toxic. They can be something that we internalize and really start to feel like negative emotions around. And so, or not negative emotions, but all emotions are like valid and good, but emotions that don't necessarily like fill you up. And so what I mean by that is like, first of all, let's talk about this should concept. Like, where does it come from? What does it mean? And I think a lot of times whenever we go into shoulds, it's very much like, hey, you should like have a nice car, for example. You should, get a good job. You should get married. And specifically for me, if we're relating this concept, when I was growing up, I grew up in rural North Carolina. And so there are a lot of expectations to, get married and settle down and have a kid, just like live like a simple little like appeasing life. And that's not what I did. That's not what I did at all. Because the societal expectation for my community of what I should do was not what suited for me. That's not what would have like made me happy. And I'm grateful that I didn't do those things. But it's just an example of some of the shoulds, or one example of a should that could be like present. A lot of times these shoulds come from our family, from our culture, from the media, telling us, we should have like a nice car and like all those other material things I mentioned initially, like in order to be successful. So that's like a concept of the shoulds. And with that being said, I want to talk a little bit about why that concept, it's hard to talk with a brush in your face, why that concept is so toxic. And so the first reason is because it creates a false sense of self. If we are doing these things, and this is what I was saying, like what's for one person isn't necessarily for everyone. If we are abiding by these shoulds, it creates a false sense of self in the way that we are doing these things that we should do, and that's not necessarily like who we are. So, the next thing you know, you're going to turn around and be like, whoa, like I don't actually, like these things that I've been doing this whole time, like when I pause and think about it. It isn't inclusive in the sense that it's, a very like tribe mentality, and I get it, that's how we, build tribes and establish like our cultures. but at the same time, it's not exclusive. It's not inclusive of the unique needs and the unique personas of individuals. And also, it leads to comparison. So, a lot of comparison in terms of like keeping up with the Joneses, right? Like these people have that, like I should too. And it's like a lot of like feelings of lack and, you know, just not really focusing on yourself and what's true for you, but rather focusing on others and, you know, like how you're different from them, which again is creating that false sense of self because you're chasing someone else's ideal. And you know what you're chasing might not even be their ideal. They might just be doing it because they think that that's what they should do too. So anyway, some things to consider while you're sitting there in wherever you're sitting or walking. I hope you're not walking. I mean, maybe, but whatever you're doing, some things to consider as you are like listening to this, and you know, just as you're moving through life, are what are some things that you think you should be? Is that like a job that you think you should have, or like a title, like you think you should be a mom or a dad, or you know, what are some things that you think you should be? And then aside from that, what are some things that you think that you should do? Is it get a job? Is it, you know, get a better job, go back to school, like dress a certain way? Like, what are some of those shoulds? And then in another capacity, what are some things that you think you should have? Because a lot of times, you know, we think that in order to be this person, we should like have these things, which not necessarily true. Not necessarily true. So yeah, just some things to consider as we are moving through this today, and as you're, you know, moving through your life. Just some things that I invite you to reflect on as you go about your day, and just become aware, you know. Just become aware of what these things are. Aside from that, I already mentioned like where these shoulds come from, like the media a lot of times, like what you watch on TV. It's very like circumstantial, but there are some like mainstream things. Like, you know, there's like the different kids in school that like some of them are like we go to different groups, and that's us kind of trying to figure out like our identity. And that's all well and good. But at the same time, it's all just dependent upon like who we're around, and like our environment really impacts these shoulds, and it really impacts like who we, you know, become whenever we are developing as individuals. So just some things to consider. You know, where did your shoulds come from? Maybe it's a childhood thing, maybe it's a new thing. I don't know. Maybe you don't know because it's so deeply ingrained, and that's okay. But just start to be mindful of where you're feeling these like obligations and pressure to live up to a certain standard or be like a certain way. Yeah, just start to be mindful of that, because you might find that that's not necessarily what you really want to be doing, you know what I'm saying? You might find out that, hey, I really rather be doing this other thing, and that's okay. It's your prerogative to change your mind at any damn time. So if you want to do that, you have free will. And that's the beautiful part about this human experience, right? Like we can shift and change and transition and transmute anytime that we feel inclined to do so. So with that being said, whenever it comes to should, representation is important, because let's think about it. If we always see a certain body type, let's see where this is going, then we're going to think that that's the ideal. And we're going to do whatever we can to try to make ourselves look like that, right? That's where like eating disorders come from. And that's another thing that you can also consider. What are some things or some ways that you think you should look or should dress? And so it's important to have representation in that regard so that we can see, like, hey, it's not that I should look like this, it's just that this is, like, there are so many different options when it comes to, like, body types and, you know, what is true, but we aren't necessarily always shown those. We're shown what they want the standards to be, what they want to sell. I'm getting, like, into, like, some capitalism concepts here because, you know, if they tell us we should be thin or if we should be built or jacked or whatever, then we're going to do whatever we can to try to chase that ideal, whether it be like buying supplements or like starving ourselves or whatever we think we can do to control that. And that's not necessarily healthy. To be chasing these unrealistic expectations, especially considering that things are photoshopped and that shit's not even real. It's not even real. Which I'm not lost on the irony of the fact that I'm doing makeup while I'm talking about, like, should. But this is, like, a fun thing for me. Like, I've reached the point where, you know, makeup, you can embrace it as a fun outlet to do things and not this way of masking, like, who you actually are. I apologize if that tapping is, like, annoying. There, we do that instead. So, anywho, I feel like I've said that a couple times, but anywho, I want to talk about guilt and shame and how that can manifest in this toxicity of should. So if we are always chasing these ideals of what we think we should be, how we think we should look, yada yada yada, then we can start to feel guilty if we aren't those things, you know, and we can start to, like, as we're playing that comparison trap, feel bad about ourselves and, like, who we are because we aren't, or we don't think that we are this ideal that's been established. And so when you think of it in that sense, there's a difference between guilt and shame. So I want to just, like, talk about what that is. Guilt is an emotional state that appears when we feel we have failed to live up to the morals of ourselves or others. All right? So you feel guilty when, like, you do something that I clearly wiped off lipstick on this yesterday. Just pretend like you didn't see that. Guilt is like when you feel like you didn't do something, like you let someone down, right? Shame is when you internalize that. So an intense feeling about the self that comes from failing to live up to your own or others' expectations. And this is that I did energy, like, oh, I did this thing, like, I feel bad, like, I feel guilty, I did this thing that, you know, I'm not so proud of, versus shame, where it's like, I am so bad, like, I'm a bad person, and you really start to internalize it, and it can start to, like, impact you in a negative way, and, like, give you anxiety, and just, like, ugh, not good things. So, whenever we think we should do and be, like, these things, and have these things, that all comes into play, because it's like, well, shit, you know, like, if I'm comparing myself to this standard, this expectation, and, like, these other people are doing it, but I'm not, like, it's not good for your self-esteem. It's not good for, you know, who you are as a person in those terms. And so it's something that can really have a negative impact. And so that's why wanted to, like, bring that part up. And so, like, there's something called non-attachment that I talk about pretty often, and that's simply just not attaching to the thing that we think that we should be, right? Like, you want to consider, yeah, great, like, there are these shoulds, and, like, maybe that works for some people, but, like, don't get so attached to the fact that, like, that's the standard, right? Like, don't necessarily, like, hold that as the epitome of the end-all, be-all, like, this is what we should strive for. I mean, if it works for you, great. Like, maybe that is something that you should do, but, you know, don't hold yourself, like, don't feel bad if what is for like others isn't necessarily for you. Like, we're all different people, you know? Like, we're all individuals. And that's okay. Like, that's what makes the world go round, and that's what, like, makes this experience unique. So, you know, just do you, and don't necessarily worry about the shoulds. So, yeah, going back to, now that we know, like, what these shoulds are, what they come from, that it is, like, obligatory, like, kind of energy, and that it can lead to these feelings of comparison and guilt and shame, and these situations that can really negatively impact our mental health. How do we go about ensuring that we don't, like, fall victim to this, or we don't, like, how do we rewrite our narratives so that we aren't, like, always telling ourselves this is what we should or shouldn't be doing? So, in that case, you're the person that talks to yourself the most, right? Like, you're the person that's inside of your head. You're the one that, you know, knows your innermost thoughts. Like, not me. I know what you tell me. I don't know if that's even true. I just know what you want me to know, because that's all I'm really privy to. And that goes for anyone. You know, like, someone can tell you, like, that they think something, and then that totally not be true. And, you know, actions speak louder than words. That's where that whole concept comes into play, because we only know, like, what that individual wants to tell us. And so we are the only ones that know, like, what goes on inside of our heads. We're the only ones that we really talk to, like, 24/7, 365 days a year. And so when you think about that, these things and these scripts and these, like, narratives that we tell ourselves are so ingrained that it's oftentimes not something that we really even give a second thought to. It's just something that, you know, kind of exists in our mind as the way that we operate, and, you know, there's nothing that we really do to change that, because it's so habitual that it's not something that we are in the habit of thinking about at this point in time, right? Because, like, it's just what we've always thought. Like, you don't know what you don't know. And so if we don't know to focus on this, like, how would we know to that this was even a thing? Like, how would we know to do any better? And in that case, let me actually pause and do some makeup here, or do some eyeliner here. Okay, don't get mad. I did that thing where I was like, let me do my eyeliner, and then I'm like, well, it's just brows and then lips, mascara aside from that. So I don't want you to have to watch me go for, like, the last, like, 5 minutes. So, as I was saying, toxicity of should. How do we then start to, if you can hear breathing, that's my little dog. How do we then start to rewrite that internal narrative and, you know, stop telling ourselves, like, we should do these things, or, you know, become more aware of whether or not these things that we think we should be doing are actually serving us? So, number one, become aware of it. So just be mindful of the thoughts that you have inside of your head, and, you know, start to observe them. I also suggest sometimes that, you know, you write it down, because that way you can start to see if there are any trends or any overlapping themes, and so that way you can, like, get a sense of, oh, well, maybe there's, like, a deeper cause with this. From there, once you notice it, ask yourself if that should is actually something that you should be doing, and, you know, if that's something that is actually, you know, serving whatever your goals are. Once you have done that, consider what the outcome is that you want, right? So that would be, like, step 3. Think about, like, what is this thing that you actually want, whether or not it is, like, the should, or whether it's something else. Just consider what would, you know, be something that if you got it or did it or became it, that you would feel like you were really leaning into your purpose, or leaning into, like, your best self. And then lastly, rewrite your script and proceed accordingly. So if you were thinking that, oh, like, I should get a nice car because that's, you know, what society tells me or what like my parents tell me or like my friends all have them or whatever the case may be, consider, is that really going to help me? Or maybe you want to focus on buying a house. So driving, a less expensive car would actually serve you and your goals more. Things like that. But yeah, so that's what I have for you for this week. The toxicity of should, where these shoulds come from, how they can manifest into our own internalization and become these emotions that lead us to feel like we're less than, and how to rewrite that script. And I hope this was helpful. Let me know if it was. Let me know if there's anything that came up for you with this, if you, again, are so inclined to share. And next week is when we're going to be talking about self-discovery. Everyone is like, just do you, but no one tells us what that really means or how to actually find out who that person is. So that's what we're going to be talking about next week. I appreciate you watching. I hope that this was helpful, and I hope that you have a wonderful day, and that, you do some things and some consideration of what it is that you should be doing. Bye. See you next week.